The scent of jet fuel mingling with fresh coffee had always been the perfume of freedom for Chloe Miller. But on that day, freedom bore an even sweeter, almost tangible aroma as she watched the clouds through the airplane window, a wide, genuine smile illuminating her face. 28 years old, American to the core, she finally felt the world lay at her feet. Chloe's heart beat to a different rhythm, a new melody of hope and newfound autonomy that seemed to herald a fresh chapter in life. It was not the frantic pace of turbulence she knew so well as a flight attendant, but rather the gentle harmony of hope, of self-determination newly claimed. Clutched in her hands, crumpled from countless rereadings, yet still handled with an almost reverent care, was the letter sealing her destiny, an acceptance for a new position with a renowned international airline based in Chicago. It was the zenith of her dreams. A life of unfettered adventure, horizons expanding with every flight, professional achievements dependent solely on her own effort and talent. Chloe imagined herself walking unknown streets, savoring exotic tastes, breathing fresh air, always certain that she was the sole architect of her own path. She closed her eyes for an instant, absorbing every beat of her heart, every fiber of optimism pulsing within her being. The scene was almost cinematic, the morning sun painting the clouds in golden and rosy hues, the promise of a brilliant future reflected in her eyes, moist with joy. She had planned every detail, every farewell, every new step. It was her pivotal moment, her chance to rewrite her own story, far from any shadow of past disillusionment or relationships that had tried to stifle her free spirit. The cabin's atmosphere was one of comforting tranquility, punctuated by the low murmur of conversations and the occasional clinking of glasses. Chloe felt herself part of a select group of people about to witness the dawn of a new chapter in their lives. The connection to the universal yearning for happiness and personal fulfillment was almost palpable, and she felt grateful to be part of that moment. Optimism surged, a wave gently cradling her, promising calm seas and favorable winds. She was already mentally arranging her new apartment, planning her first immersion into a different culture, anticipating the scent of coffee yet to be brewed in her future kitchen. Suddenly, the comfortable silence of the cabin was shattered. A sharp, unexpected sound, like an electronic shriek, echoed through the speakers. It was the emergency notification, an alert she knew well, but one she never expected to hear as a passenger. The low hum ceased abruptly. All eyes turned to the in-flight system, to the blinking lights and to the pilot's voice, which, moments later, filled the space with an unusual gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have an urgent notification. Due to unforeseen and urgent technical issues, we are compelled to alter our route and make an unscheduled landing at a private airport. We ask for everyone's understanding and to follow our crew's instructions." Tension settled like a heavy cloak, replacing the initial lightness with a chilling apprehension. The previously relaxed faces now showed lines of concern, eyes wide and mouths agape. A brief panic spread like a silent virus, manifesting in nervous whispers and restless movements. Chloe, with her vast aviation experience, tried to maintain her composure. Her professional instinct compelled her to analyze the situation logically, to search for signs of genuine danger. But within, a pang of foreboding began to surface. Urgent technical issues? On a domestic flight? And an unscheduled private airport landing? That didn't sound like standard procedure. The public's curiosity and her own was piqued. What could be so dire as to divert an entire flight, discarding hours of planning and pre-established routes? The flight attendants, with strained smiles, attempted to reassure the passengers, but the rigidity in their shoulders and the way their eyes evaded passengers' gazes betrayed their own uncertainty. Chloe observed them, searching for a sign. A secret code only those who inhabit the skies would comprehend. But there was nothing beyond the same confusion she felt. The plane began its descent, steeper and faster than normal, slicing through the air with a whistle that seemed to portend a dramatic outcome. The rhythm of that joyful melody in her heart was replaced by a frenzied drumming, a premonition that refused to be ignored. The aircraft finally broke through the cloud cover, revealing a vast, desolate landscape where only the horizon stretched infinitely. There were no signs of a town, nor any other structures, just sprawling plains and distant rocky mountains. The airstrip suddenly appeared long and solitary, like a scar across the middle of nowhere. The landing was abrupt, with a jolt that made Chloe gasp, feeling the seatbelt tighten against her body. The plane came to a halt, not at a bustling terminal with jet bridges, but in an isolated area under the scorching sun. And then she saw it. Beside the airstrip, imposing and mysterious, an ultra-luxury private jet awaited. Its fuselage gleamed beneath the sunlight, an ostentatious symbol of power and wealth. It was an elegant solitary machine, seemingly placed there with deliberate intent, waiting. Chloe's heart leaped, not from fear, but from a strange and powerful intuition. This was no ordinary technical stop. The question that hung in the air as dense as the searing heat was, what awaited Chloe Miller outside that plane, and how might it impact the future of freedom and autonomy she so fiercely desired? The letter in her hand seemed suddenly a fragile and insignificant piece of paper against that vision. The sepulchral silence that followed the flight's abrupt interruption was broken only by the faint hum of resting engines and the echo of Chloe Miller's own heart, beating like an off-kilter drum in her chest. The flight attendant, still processing the overwhelming image she had glimpsed through the window, an imposing ultra-luxury private jet and an entourage of men in the middle of nowhere, felt a chill snake down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the vast, isolated Wyoming landscape stretching infinitely outside. The cabin, once filled with the routine bustle of a domestic flight, now seemed a time capsule, suspended between a terrifyingly unknown before and after. A tremor coursed through the aircraft as the main door hissed open with a mechanical sigh. Chloe expected to see maintenance technicians, perhaps emergency crews, to explain the forced landing, but the reality that presented itself was far more sinister, absurdly orchestrated. A group of private security, impeccably dressed in dark suits that contrasted sharply with the light, windswept earth of the Wyoming high plains, entered the plane with almost military precision. Their faces were stern, impassive, each movement calculated to intimidate. Ahead of them, an athletically built man with a penetrating gaze swept the cabin, his cold eyes stopping directly on Chloe. He didn't need to utter a word. A mere nod of his head, and the security detail moved towards her, like predatory shadows. Chloe's initial confusion rapidly gave way to a visceral fear. "What is happening?" her mind screamed, but the words caught in her throat. She tried to rise, but one of the security men stopped her with a firm touch on her shoulder. Not aggressive, yet making it clear that disobedience was not an option. It was then that, from the aircraft's entrance, an even more imposing figure emerged. Ethan Vance. His name, which once echoed as a distant memory of secret nights and stolen passions, now resonated with the force of a decree. He stood there, framed by the golden light of the Wyoming sun, outlining his powerful silhouette. His dark eyes, which had so often consumed her with desire, now fixed on her with an intensity bordering on outright possession. Chloe felt the air thin in her lungs. This man, the billionaire who had taken her to peaks of pleasure and enveloped her in a world of luxury, was now the personification of her nightmare. He did not rush. He walked slowly down the aisle, each measured step a stark reminder of his incontestable power. The security detail parted, clearing a path for their master. When Ethan stopped a few feet from Chloe, she could feel the heat radiating from him, a volatile mix of contained fury and icy determination. "Chloe," he said, his voice calm yet laden with an unquestionable authority that sent a shiver down her spine. "You won't be going to your new job." Those words, uttered with terrifying coldness, were a brutal shock. The ground seemed to vanish beneath Chloe's feet. Her new job, her escape, her new life in Chicago. Everything crumbled with the cruel simplicity of that single phrase. Rage began to bubble, boiling up through the fear. "What do you mean I'm not going? Who do you think you are to decide that?" she thought, indignation poised to explode. Ethan continued, as if reading her thoughts and disdaining them. "You tried to abandon me, Chloe, to betray the connection we built, the moments we shared. Did you truly believe you could simply disappear?" There was a flicker of hurt in his voice, but it was suffocated by an even greater fury. Abandon. Chloe finally managed to stammer, her voice choked, a volatile mixture of disbelief and rage. I have a life, Ethan. My plans, my career. I am not some plaything for you to keep and discard at your whim. She rose abruptly, defying the security detail with her glare, summoning a courage she barely knew she possessed. What kind of charade is this? I demand an explanation. I demand my freedom. You have no right to keep me here. Her voice trembled, but she tried to sound firm, invoking her rights as an American citizen, her autonomy, everything that defined her as an independent American woman. But Ethan remained unyielding, his dark eyes fixed on her without a flicker of hesitation. You have no choice, Chloe, he decreed, and the chill in his words struck a direct blow to her soul. Your plans have been altered. Your new life begins now, and it won't be in Chicago. Had there been a camera, it would have focused on Chloe's face at that instant. Initial indignation gave way to a burgeoning dread, a glacial understanding of the situation's gravity. This wasn't a discussion, it wasn't a whim, it was an order, and he possessed the power, the means, and the determination to execute it. The reality of her captivity began to materialize, dense and suffocating. Without another word, Ethan extended his hand to her, not in a gesture of affection, but of stark possession. When she hesitated, he grasped her arm with a firmness that allowed no refusal, guiding her, almost dragging her, out of the aircraft and towards his private jet. Each step was an agony. Each gust of wind across the Wyoming plains seemed to whisper, "Prisoner." The luxurious jet, which once represented a journey of pleasure and secret rendezvous, now felt like a golden cage, a floating cell. As she was pushed inside, Chloe felt her heart constrict. The central conflict was established, brutal and undeniable. Her freedom, her independent American flight attendant spirit, against the overwhelming possessiveness and limitless power of Ethan Vance. Where was he taking her? For what purpose? Anguish consumed her as the private jet, with Ethan at her side, began to taxi down the makeshift runway, lifting off the ground and carrying her towards an unknown destination, laden with a dark promise, one that would change her life forever. The private jet's abrupt landing in the desolate Wyoming plains was no less shocking than the turbulent journey that preceded it. Chloe felt a final lurch before the turbines silenced, plunging the aircraft's interior into a heavy, almost oppressive quiet that brutally contrasted with the deafening roar of minutes before. The jet door opened with a mechanical hiss, and a gust of warm air laden with the scent of dry earth and something wild invaded the cabin, enveloping her. Outside, beneath a sky beginning to dye itself with the orange and purple hues of the western twilight, stretched a landscape both breathtaking and heartbreaking. On the horizon, like a mirage solidifying, rose the Sky Mesa Retreat. It was an astonishing sight, an edifice of pale stone that seemed to organically spring from the rugged terrain, its vast glass panels gleaming under the last rays of sun, and intricate architectural details promising secrets and luxury. Lush, manicured gardens with towering evergreens and cascading water features contrasted surreally with the surrounding aridity, an oasis of opulence that defied nature itself. It was beautiful, yes, but for Chloe it was the perfect frame for her gilded cage. That place was not a refuge, it was the apex of isolation, the materialization of the dark promise Ethan harbored. Two burly guards in impeccable tailored suits and serious demeanors appeared at the door, their eyes fixed on Chloe. Ethan, with unnerving calm, gestured for her to disembark. The flight attendant descended the stairs, every fiber of her being screaming in protest, but her movements were automatic, like those of a marionette. Her feet touched the perfectly maintained tarmac of a private airstrip, and she felt the fine dust of the high desert beneath her soles, a sense of alienness mingling with burgeoning fear. The air was warm, dry, and the immensity of the rugged Wyoming landscape stretched out on all sides, a natural barrier as effective as any prison wall. She was led through massive, intricately carved gates of rich wood, which opened into an inner courtyard where the water from a crystal-clear fountain murmured softly. The subtle fragrance of wild botanicals and fresh earth floated in the air, a seductive attempt to mask the brutal reality. Chloe was guided into one of the retreat's most majestic corridors, her footsteps echoing on the polished marble. The quarters designated for her were more than sumptuous. They were a vision of untold luxury. Fine silks adorned the walls, bespoke area rugs graced the floor, and a gigantic four-poster bed seemed to invite her to a rest she knew she would never find there. A balcony opened to a breathtaking view of the gardens and the vast plains beyond, reinforcing both the beauty and the impossibility of escape. As Chloe absorbed the suffocating grandeur of the place, Ethan Vance entered the room, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her instinctively recoil. He needed no guards to impose his presence. His aura of power was sufficient. Ethan stopped a few paces from her, his expression indecipherable. It was then that the words, cold and definitive as an absolute decree, cut the air, sealing her fate. "You do not leave here without my child in your womb." Chloe's heart leaped, a dull thud reverberating in her ears. The phrase, uttered with unshakable conviction, struck her like a physical blow. She felt a shiver trace down her spine, horror mingling with a rage that bubbled in her chest. It was insane, absurd, a madness worthy of a dark fairy tale. But the seriousness in Ethan's eyes left no room for doubt. He truly believed it, and was capable of anything to achieve his desire. In a slow, deliberate movement, Ethan extended his hand, and Chloe, with an uncontrollable tremor, watched her passport being withdrawn from her bag and handed to him. The document, her link to freedom, to her life in America, to everything she was flipped through by him for an instant and then tucked into a pocket of his tailored suit jacket. It was a symbolic gesture, yet devastating. The passport was her identity, her passage back home, and now it was in her captor's hands. It was the final cut, the last bridge burned. She was indeed stranded. "This is insanity. You cannot do this. I am an American citizen. You will face serious legal repercussions," Chloe exclaimed, her voice choked by disbelief but charged with escalating fury. She tried to advance, perhaps to retrieve the passport, perhaps to strike him, but an invisible force held her back. Her eyes flashed, her body trembled, but not from paralyzing fear, but from an overwhelming indignation. "You are mine. And here, in this retreat, my laws prevail," he replied without a single wrinkle on his brow, without a single trace of emotion that might betray any doubt. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of centuries of authority and power. To him, her resistance was not a cry for freedom, but a challenge to be dominated, an expected step in his obsessive plan. He did not hold her with visible chains, but with the utter absence of options, with the implacable vastness of the wilderness that surrounded her, and with the promise of a future she did not want. Chloe felt overwhelming helplessness. She pleaded, argued about her rights, threatened with high-profile legal and media repercussions, but every word was absorbed by Ethan's calculating indifference. He did not blink, did not yield, showed not a speck of remorse. His eyes seemed to see beyond her rage, perhaps discerning the fragility of his own childhood traumas, the pathological fear of abandonment that propelled him to such extreme acts. But Chloe did not know this yet. To her, he was merely a powerful, cruel man, a kidnapper stealing her life. Nevertheless, amidst her despair, a spark of defiance glinted in Chloe's eyes. She was an American, hardened by ambition, refusing to yield. She might be trapped, but her spirit would not be subjugated. The chemistry between them, once a secret, forbidden attraction, now transformed into a volcanic force, mixing hatred, a latent desire that terrified her, and an undeniable tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. How would she survive there? The vastness of the Sky Mesa retreat, with its gleaming walls and soaring ceilings, seemed to mock her silent question, twisting luxury into a gilded cage. Chloe, however, was not one to surrender easily. In the first days of her golden captivity, the American flight attendant channeled her rage into fuel for a resistance that, though futile, was the only thing preserving her sanity. Silver platters, laden with gourmet American cuisine, returned to the kitchen untouched, a silent act of defiance that made her stomach rumble in protest, yet her spirit refused to yield. She refused to nourish her body within a prison that suffocated her soul. The retreat staff, an assembly of silent attendants and discreet security personnel, formed an army of unwavering loyalty to Ethan Vance. Chloe tried with a desperate blend of hope and futility to approach some of them, searching for a thread of humanity, a fissure in their armor of obedience. In English, with imploring gestures and gazes, she attempted to explain her plight, the injustice, the abduction. But she received only polite replies in English that, though courteous, were devoid of any promise of aid. "Ma'am, Mr. Vance is our principal. We are here to serve him," they would murmur, their voices low and their eyes averted, as if fearing even Ethan's shadow. It was akin to speaking to walls, and frustration swelled within her like a rising tide. The idea of escape, however, was what nourished her restless mind most. She observed the guards' routines, the layout of the windows, the immensity of the rugged Wyoming landscape that stretched as far as the eye could see, a treacherous sea of windswept plains and jagged peaks. She planned each step with the precision of one acquainted with imminent danger, envisioning herself sprinting beneath the scorching sun, chasing a mirage of freedom. On a moonless night, her heart hammering erratically in her chest, Chloe slipped from her quarters, dressed in light clothes and carrying only a stolen bottle of water from the kitchen. She reached a side door that led to a smaller courtyard, and from there to the vast wilderness. Adrenaline pulsed through her veins, the taste of freedom for an instant almost tangible. But the mirage dissolved before she could take 10 steps in the soft sand. 2 shadows emerged from nowhere, guards who seemed to possess eyes in the back of their heads, blocking her path with chilling efficiency. There was no violence, no shouts. Just a, "Ma'am, please return to your quarters," spoken in a firm voice, utterly devoid of warmth. She was escorted back, her escape attempt thwarted and humiliation burning hot on her face. There was no escaping. The Sky Mesa retreat was not merely a structure, it was an impenetrable fortress, and Ethan had anticipated her every move. The futility of her actions struck her like a gut punch. Her anger, once a fiery propulsion, now mingled with an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. It was in this state of mind that Ethan found her the next day, seated in one of the opulent armchairs of his private living area, observing her with those dark, intense eyes. He did not mention the escape attempt, but the slight tightening of his lips and his fixed gaze on her revealed that he knew everything. "Chloe," he began, his voice calm yet imbued with unquestionable authority. "You need to eat. Your health is important." She looked at him with disdain, fury bubbling within her. "My health? You care about my health? You kidnapped me, Ethan Vance. You brought me to this luxurious hell in the middle of nowhere and imprisoned me here. You are a monster, a despicable tyrant who believes he can purchase and control people's lives." The words gushed out, laden with all the hatred and frustration she had accumulated. Her eyes blazed, daring him to react, to display the cruel face she expected. Ethan did not yell, nor did he threaten her. To Chloe's surprise and her own, his reaction was utterly different. A shadow crossed his face, an almost imperceptible expression of pain that did not escape Chloe's notice. His shoulders seemed to slump minimally, and for a fleeting instant, the mask of absolute control fractured, revealing a fissure in his formidable armor. It was a glimpse of something deeper, something wounded behind the facade of power and arrogance. He averted his gaze for a second, his lips tightening into a thin line, as if containing an overwhelming emotion. Without uttering a word, without a gesture of anger, Ethan rose and withdrew, leaving Chloe alone in the vastness of the room, her own words echoing in the heavy silence. She stood there, paralyzed, processing the scene. The fury still simmered, bubbling, but now it was tinged with a jolt of curiosity that caught her by surprise. What was that? That pain in his eyes, the way he seemed to flinch, the silence instead of the expected explosion. Could Ethan Vance, the man who had abducted her and held her captive in his retreat, be more than just a one-dimensional villain, perhaps a complex, wounded man? The idea was disturbing, almost deranged, yet the seed of doubt had been firmly planted. What had made him so obsessive, so possessive? What was the source of that anguish he tried to conceal beneath layers of power and control? Chloe, despite her justifiable rage, began to feel a stirring of something more, a compelling need to comprehend the man behind the title and the monstrous actions. It was not compassion, not yet, but an intense curiosity that compelled her to peer beyond the surface. The inevitability of their physical proximity hung heavy in the air, and Chloe knew Ethan would not abandon his decree. He would relentlessly, obsessively strive to fulfill his grim promise, leading to moments of intense intimacy and an even deeper turmoil within her already troubled heart. The opulence of Sky Mesa Retreat, once a spectacle of architecture and wealth, had for Chloe Miller transformed into a gilded cage where every silk, every jewel, and every gourmet delicacy served only to accentuate the cruelty of her captivity. Her initial resistance, fueled by rage and desperation, began to yield under the weight of reality. There was nowhere to run, no one to hear her screams amidst the vastness of that unforgiving Wyoming landscape. Ethan Vance, aware of his prisoner's silent surrender, intensified his obsessive devotion, not with brute force, but with a strategy that was, in its own way, even more perverse. Seduction and enforced intimacy, interspersed with demonstrations of an almost tender care, disarming Chloe in a way violence never could. He surrounded her with a luxury that bordered on the unreal, as if she were living inside a dramatic movie where everything was grand and theatrical. Days were filled with strolls through the meticulously landscaped grounds, meals that resembled royal banquets, and conversations that Ethan skillfully steered toward her dreams and fears. He listened to her with an unsettling intensity, probing for every detail of her past, her aspirations as a free, traveling flight attendant. In return, he shared carefully selected fragments of his own life, small vulnerabilities that seemed calculated to break down her defenses. He spoke of the pressure of his lineage, the loneliness of his position, an emptiness that seemed to echo her own. Chloe, at first, saw everything as manipulation, a cruel game. But there was something in those dark eyes, a genuine melancholy that at times made her doubt her own conviction. It was like a tumultuous symphony of emotions, where the joy of beauty mingled with the sadness of imprisonment. The nights, however, were the true battleground, an emotional and physical struggle that consumed Chloe from within. The chemistry between them, undeniable since their first encounter on Ethan's private jet, exploded in moments of overwhelming passion. Ethan was an experienced lover, patient, and paradoxically capable of a tenderness that disarmed her. He did not physically force her, but enveloped her in a labyrinth of touches, kisses, and whispered words that led her to a point where the line between desire and repulsion blurred dangerously. She found herself in a maelstrom of emotions. Rage simmered in her chest over her situation. Contempt for Ethan's control was constant, but to her own horror, an undeniable and disturbing attraction began to manifest. It was a betrayal of her own body, an affront to her mind, and she fought with all her might to deny what she felt. On one particularly intense night, after a long dinner where Ethan had spoken about the stars and how they aligned their destinies, the atmosphere in the bedroom was charged. He kissed her with an urgency that seemed to plead for something deeper than mere physical pleasure. Chloe felt herself melting under his touch, her body responding to a primal call she detested. His lips, his hands, the way he held her. For an instant she almost forgot the reality of her captivity, almost surrendered to the illusion that this was consensual, desired. But suddenly, like a brutal splash of cold reality, lucidity struck her with crushing force. An image of her life before him, of her freedom, of her dreams, flickered into her mind. Horror seized her. With a muffled cry, Chloe abruptly pushed him away, shoving his chest with trembling hands. The air left her lungs in a choked gasp. She retreated to the edge of the bed, eyes wide, body trembling. "No, I can't," she whispered, more to herself than to him. A wave of nausea invaded her. Disgust. Disgust for Ethan, yes, but above all, disgust for herself. How could her body betray her in such a way? How could she feel anything for her captor? It was an aberration, a sickness. She felt dirty, defiled by her own response. Shame consumed her, and silent tears streamed down her face. Ethan, who had recoiled a step at the abrupt rejection, watched her with an expression that mixed frustration and an almost childlike pain. His eyes, once burning, became opaque. "Chloe, what's wrong? I wouldn't hurt you," he said, his voice hoarse, extending his hand towards her, but stopping in midair, respecting the invisible barrier she had erected. He seemed genuinely confused, as if he couldn't fathom the depth of her revulsion. But even in the face of the pain she felt, the determination in his eyes did not waver. He wanted this connection, this child, with an intensity that bordered on insanity. It was a facet of his personality that desperately sought union, even if in a twisted and unilateral way. This was the second small twist in her private hell. Chloe was no longer fighting merely against Ethan, against the walls of Sky Mesa Retreat. She was at war with her own conflicting feelings. With each touch, each word, each moment of intense proximity, she questioned herself. Was she losing herself? Was she adapting to his madness? Or, even more terrifying, was there something deeper, a twisted connection, emerging from the ashes of her hatred? The complexity of human attraction, even in such morally ambiguous circumstances, was an inescapable labyrinth. She felt like a character in a dramatic film, trapped in a script she did not choose. Each day, Chloe's internal struggle intensified. She sought an escape, a glimmer of light, anything that could make sense of that nightmare. It was on one of these days, as she tried to distract herself by reading a book in the retreat's library, that a familiar figure approached. Eleanor Vance, Ethan's aunt, a woman of serious mien and keen observation, whom Chloe had met few times, but who always watched her with a mixture of distrust and veiled curiosity. Eleanor carried a tray of tea and delicate gourmet pastries. She said nothing at first, merely placed the tray on the small table beside Chloe and sat in a nearby armchair, her eyes fixed on the young woman. After a long silence, one that stretched like the longest New Year's Eve wait, Eleanor finally spoke, her voice low, almost a whisper, as if she feared being overheard by the walls of the retreat. "Ethan, he is not as you think, child. There are shadows in his past, deep wounds that shaped him." The revelation about the wounds that shaped Ethan hung in the air, a silent echo resonating through the corridors of the Sky Mesa Retreat, and more intensely within Chloe's mind. The days that followed that conversation with the magnate's aunt were no less strange, but they gained a new hue. Chloe still felt imprisoned, still yearned for her freedom, but the pure hatred, once a voracious flame, now crackled with embers of painful understanding. She saw Ethan differently, not just as her tormentor, but as a complex man, broken by a past she was only beginning to glimpse. It was like looking at an abstract painting. Before, only smudges of color. Now lines and forms began to emerge, revealing a more defined, though still disturbing, image. It was in this scenario of contradictory emotions that Ethan's aunt, Eleanor Vance, made her majestic entry into the retreat. Eleanor was not merely a secondary figure. She was the personification of tradition and wisdom, a woman whose presence commanded respect. Her gaze initially was a study in distrust, evaluating Chloe with a veiled curiosity, like one observing an exotic piece that, despite its beauty, did not belong in that environment. Eleanor visited the Sky Mesa Retreat periodically, not only to check on her nephew's well-being, but to ensure that the pillars of the Vance family remained unshaken. And Chloe's presence, that of a stranger, an American flight attendant, was undoubtedly a pillar to be examined. Chloe, for her part, felt the weight of Eleanor's gaze, but she was not intimidated. She maintained her posture, her dignity, even within that golden cage. There was a resilience in her that Eleanor, with her acute perception, began to notice. It was not the stubbornness of a child, but the silent strength of a woman who refused to be broken. Amidst the formal dinners, where etiquette dictated every movement, and the strolls through the luxuriant landscaping, Eleanor observed Chloe with growing curiosity. She perceived the melancholy in the young woman's eyes, but also the flame of an indomitable spirit. One day, while taking tea in a secluded gazebo, the vast clear Wyoming sky overhead calming their spirits, Eleanor broke the silence. Her voice was soft, but charged with a discreet authority. "You have eyes that have seen much, child," she said, her dark eyes fixed on Chloe's, and a heart that refuses to bend. Chloe merely nodded, unsure how to respond. It was then that Eleanor, as if unfolding an ancient scroll, began to share fragments of Ethan's past. "My nephew, he was born to be great, but his childhood was marked by tragedy," Eleanor began, her voice a whisper the Wyoming wind seemed to carry. "He lost his parents in a terrible accident when he was just a boy, barely old enough to grasp the dimension of the loss. Suddenly, little Ethan, who should have been playing and learning, found himself the sole heir to an empire. The mantle of leadership was placed upon his shoulders too soon, before he even knew what it was to be simply a boy." Chloe listened, the tea cooling in her cup. The image of Ethan Vance, imposing and controlling, began to disintegrate, giving way to that of a frightened, solitary boy. "He was raised in an environment of immense pressure," Eleanor continued, her voice tinged with an ancient sorrow. "Every step was observed, every decision analyzed. There was no room for weakness, for error. Solitude was his only companion, for everyone around him saw him as the future head of the Vance Empire, not as a child who needed affection and support. The expectation of inheriting and protecting the family's legacy was a burden too heavy for such small shoulders." Eleanor paused, her gaze lost on the golden horizon of the Wyoming plains. "He fears abandonment more than anything, Chloe. It is a fear that consumes him, that drives him to control everything and everyone around him. He believes that if he keeps the reins tight, no one can leave him, just as his parents left him so early." Eleanor's words were like an electric shock to Chloe. They did not justify Ethan's actions by any means, but they offered a psychological context, a key to unraveling the complexity of that man. The seed of compassion was planted deep and painful in Chloe's heart. She did not hate him less for his attitudes, but now she saw him through a different lens. He was not merely a tyrant, a kidnapper. He was a wounded man, imprisoned by his own traumas, a ghost of his childhood haunting his present. The madness Chloe so feared now seemed rooted in a pain so profound it bordered on insanity. Understanding began to intertwine with desire, not a romantic desire, but a magnetic pull to the complexity of that being. The chemistry between them, which before was a volcanic force of attraction and repulsion, now gained layers of empathy. Chloe began to see beyond the armor of power and possessiveness, glimpsing the solitary boy Ethan once was. With this new perspective, the dynamic between Chloe and Ethan subtly shifted. She still resisted, still sought her freedom, but her reactions to his advances were no longer of pure disdain. There was a hint of reluctance, a spark of curiosity, perhaps even a desire to try to understand. Ethan, in turn, seemed to sense the change in the air, a diminishing of the impenetrable barrier Chloe erected between them. He intensified his attempts to impregnate her, but now, perhaps, with an urgency that was not just of duty, but of a desperate search for connection. One late afternoon, after another day of tensions and calculated approaches, Ethan found her in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. He approached in silence, and Chloe did not pull away. "You are different," he said, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. "Your eyes, they see me in a new way." Chloe turned to him, courage blooming from her new understanding. "I see a broken man, Ethan," she responded, her voice firm but without anger. "Not just a magnate. I see the pain behind your fury, the fear behind your control." Ethan's gaze became complex, a mixture of surprise, contained rage, and perhaps a glimpse of vulnerability he rarely showed. He took a step forward, and Chloe did not recoil. "What do you know of my pain?" he questioned, his voice low and dangerous. "I know what Eleanor told me," Chloe confessed, her heart pounding. "About your parents, about the loneliness, about the burden you carry. I understand your fear of abandonment, Ethan, but that doesn't justify what you did. It doesn't justify keeping me here." The tension between them was palpable, dense as the Wyoming air before a storm. For an instant, Chloe thought he would explode, that fury would consume him. But he did not. Instead, his eyes, previously filled with rage, softened with an ancient pain, a pain Chloe now recognized. "You cannot understand," he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. You have never been alone as I have been." In that moment, something broke between them, and something new was born. It was not love, not yet, but it was a connection, an invisible thread woven of understanding and vulnerability. Chloe's barrier of pure hatred crumbled, giving way to a complex tapestry of emotions where compassion and desire dangerously intertwined. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's obsessive dedication to impregnating her continued, but now with a different nuance. There were moments of a strange tenderness, of a proximity that both frightened and attracted Chloe at the same time. And then, it happened. The confirmation came in a positive pregnancy test, a small stick holding Chloe's fate in her hands. The news fell upon the Sky Mesa retreat like a silent thunder. Ethan, upon learning, experienced a contained euphoria, a sense of triumph mixed with an emotion Chloe couldn't decipher. "You will no longer leave here," he said, his eyes fixed on Chloe's still flat belly. But this time there was something more in his voice, something that seemed less like a threat and more like a promise. Chloe, however, was in a whirlwind. The pregnancy was real, Ethan's child growing inside her. His somber promise had been fulfilled, and now she needed to make the most important decision of her life. The passport, which he had confiscated, was back in her hands, a symbol of her newfound freedom, but also a reminder of what she was about to leave behind. Would that child, conceived in captivity, be her freedom or her eternal bond? Eleanor, upon learning of the pregnancy, looked at Chloe with a new gleam in her eyes, a gleam of approval and affection. "A child is a blessing, dear," she said, "and a bond that not even the vastness of Wyoming can break." Chloe spent sleepless nights walking through the retreat's gardens, her heart divided. She could leave, go back to her life in America, raise her child away from that world of gilded luxury and vast plains, away from Ethan Vance. But the Ethan she knew now was not the same man who had kidnapped her. He was still possessive, still carried his scars, but she saw in him the capacity to love, to change, to be more than his trauma. She felt that somehow she had planted a seed of hope in his heart as well. Her decision came with the first strong heartbeat of the baby she felt in her womb. It was not an easy choice, nor a fairy tale. It was a choice forged in pain, in understanding, and yes, in a complex love that had grown from the ashes of hatred. She chose to stay, not as a prisoner, but as a woman who, despite everything, had found a home and an unexpected love amidst the isolation of Wyoming. She would stay to give her child a father and a mother, to try to heal Ethan's wounds and perhaps her own. She would stay to build a family, to transform that retreat into a true home where love could freely blossom. The Sky Mesa retreat, once her prison, now transformed into her home, a place where she and Ethan together could rewrite the destiny etched by their traumas. Their child would be the bridge between two worlds, proof that love can emerge in the most unexpected places and that understanding can heal the deepest wounds. Chloe, the free-spirited American flight attendant, found in the heart of the possessive magnate not just a captor but a partner, a man who, despite his flaws, loved her in his intense and unbreakable way. And she, in turn, learned that freedom doesn't always mean leaving, but finding her own path, her own power, even in a place that seemed like a cage. And so, the story of Chloe and Ethan concludes, not with a simple, happily ever after, but with the promise of a future built on the foundations of human complexity, forgiveness, and the capacity to love. Even when love emerges from the most improbable circumstances, it is a reminder that life is full of nuances and that the most difficult choices can lead us to the most surprising destinations. And you? What did you think of this twist in Chloe and Ethan's story? Do you think Chloe made the right choice? Leave your comment below, give a like if you enjoyed this intense journey, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that will stir your heart.